Hello friends, good afternoon and welcome to EduSite Live Lectures. Dear friends, today in Indian philosophy we will be talking about Sunyavada Philosophy Part 4. To discuss this topic we have with us our subject expert Dr. Ajay Verma. Dr. Verma is Associate Professor in Center for Philosophy, School of Social Sciences, JNU. Without further ado, I would like to welcome Sir to our studios and request him to start the lecture. Hello, sir.
Hello viewers. In the series on Sunyavada, so this is going to be the next lecture in that series. In the previous lecture, we have looked at Sunyavada's argument against causation, and also in his argument against essence, which the Sanskrit term for which is Swabhava. So we saw how Nagarjuna, who is the main propounder of Sunyavada philosophy, how he argues, what kind of arguments he offers against two of the most popular theories around that time, which were Satkaryavad and Asatkaryavad. So we had a look at how he presents criticism of both these theories, and presents his own theory on the issue, which is Pratiti Samatpad, which means that everything is dependently originated. In the previous lectures, we also saw how Swabhav Shunyata, once the Swabhav Shunyata of things is established, it leads to Drishti Shunyata also. So Swabhav Shunyata means proving that things are without any essences, things are without any Swabhava, things are without any nature of their own. So there is nothing permanent existing in the things, and it leads to Drishti Shunyata, because if the objects do not have any nature of their own, then we cannot. Then any way of looking at them would be, so to speak, only a provisional way of looking at them. So there will be a complete sense. Their things are, so to speak, void in themselves. Things are nothing in themselves, so to speak. Therefore, any kind of view of those things, would not be able to define, the object comprehensively. So therefore, if the objects in the world are without any svabhava, without any nature of their own, then that would lead to Drishti Shunyata as well. Then there could be no absolutely right way of looking at them. There may be no absolutely right philosophical view of them. If things are void, then we will have to see them as void, and that would mean the Shunyata which is ascribed to Swabhava of things would have to that the same Shunyata has to be ascribed to our ways of looking at those things. So there's nothing absolute, so to speak, according to Sunyavadan. First of all, in the objects themselves, in the sense that they lack their own nature, and there is nothing absolute. There could be nothing absolute about any philosophies regarding the world, in the same way. So now moving on from there, first of all, let's try and understand this position. So once we assume this position that philosophizing about the world, philosophizing about the objects of the world, trying to know their exact nature, is now not possible according to Sunyavadan, or the only way to possibly look at them is that things are devoid of any nature, and therefore only philosophy that could be offered about them it has to be equally void, so to speak, has to be equally shunya. So now once we declare that any philosophical way of looking at the world is as empty as any other, is as void as any other, or as non-yielding as any other, then we are taking a position where sort of which somebody might believe that that knowledge is not possible. So in a certain way somebody might argue that this position is tantamount to saying that there could be no knowledge of the world, because the way we define knowledge, especially when we talk about knowledge in the discipline of philosophy, then what we mean by knowledge is the right view of things, the absolutely correct view of things, in the sense that our view should have the element of truth in it. So it should our knowledge is a belief which truly represents its object and which could be justified, and so it has to be a justified true belief. But on Sunyavadan account, since there is no absolute truth about the world, so therefore there could be no sort of absolute knowledge about it. So therefore what we call drishti shunyata. So that position in a way would be tantamount to saying that knowledge, in the absolute sense of the term, knowledge of the world is not possible. So, and we already know that such kind of position in philosophy is known as skepticism. Now, of course, it remains a moot point whether whether it'll be right. It is right to call Sunyavadan a skeptic, or not. But but so far as Sunyavadan is declaring that there could be no absolutely right way, there could be no absolutely right view of things, drishti of about things which truly represents the nature of the world. We probably could call them a skeptic in a certain sense. But one argument that is often cited against skeptics is that even when they are saying that all drishtis, all philosophical ways of looking at things are equally empty, are equally void, are equally shunya, isn't it a view in itself? Isn't it a kind of philosophy in itself? Isn't it a philosophical view of looking at things? So even when you say that everything in the world is shunya, is void, it is a view. And even when you say that therefore all the different ways, all the various ways of looking at the world are equally void, even then that itself is a way of looking at the world. So that in itself is a philosophical view. So now, an argument from the other side could be that if any philosopher assuming such position that everything is void, therefore all the ways of looking at the things, looking at the world are equally void, then the same thing applies to that view as well. Meaning to say, then that view that things are void is also void. If that is the case, then skeptic's position is abandoned, and that would sort of and once his position is abandoned, that would mean that a position contrary to it should be accepted. So now this has been a sort of a perennial kind of a debate. Each time a philosopher who is speaking from the point of view of a skeptic talks about impossibility of knowledge, this is one of the arguments that is raised from the other side of the table. So now, having known that, it will be interesting for us to understand how Nagarjuna, being a Sunyavadan, and if we equate him if we equate his position with that of skepticism, then how would he argue against such charges? So as a matter of fact, he does take up some of these objections in his rather rather small work, which is Vigrahavivartani. So Vigrahavivartani, as a matter of fact, begins with this objection. So Nagarjuna sort of cites in the beginning of the text the possible objection coming from the opponent regarding his position. So, so now from this, it will be interesting for us to see from this text how Nagarjuna would try to counter, this objection which has always been offered against the skeptic. So let's try and look at that. So the text Vigrahavivartani, the argument that is offered by the opponent against Nagarjuna's position, against the skeptic position, is something like this. The opponent says, if an intrinsic nature of the things, whatever they may be, exists nowhere, sarvatra na vidyate, then your very statement must be devoid of an intrinsic nature. It is not, therefore, in a position to deny the intrinsic nature of the things. Whether in the causes, hetu, in the conditions, pratyaya, in the combination of the causes and the conditions, hetu, pratyaya, samagri, or in different thing, nowhere does exist an intrinsic nature of the things, whatever they may be. Further, the opponent argues, on this ground, it is said that all things are void. For instance, the sprout is neither in the seed, its cause, nor in the things known as its conditions, which are earth, water, fire, wind, etc., taken one by one, nor in the totality of the conditions, nor in the combination of the causes and the conditions, nor is it anything different from the causes and the conditions. Since there is nowhere an intrinsic nature, the sprout is devoid of an intrinsic nature, so it is nisvabhava. Being devoid of an intrinsic nature, it is void, and just as the sprout is devoid of an intrinsic nature and hence void, so also are all the things. Now, what the opponent concludes from this argument is, so quoting from the same text, translated by Bhattacharya, so the opponent says, therefore we conclude from it, here we observe, if this is so, your statement that all things are void must also be void. Why? Because your statement is neither in its cause, the four great elements, Mahabhutas, taken collectively or individually, nor in its conditions, the efforts made in the breast, the throat, the lips, the tongue, the throat, the roots of the teeth, the palate, the nose, the head, etc., nor in the combination of both the causes and the conditions, nor again is it anything apart from the causes and the conditions. Since it is nowhere, it is devoid of an intrinsic nature. And since it is devoid of an intrinsic nature, it is void. So, the further conclusion that is drawn from here is that for this reason, your statement is incapable of denying the intrinsic nature of all things. A fire that does not exist cannot burn, a weapon that does not exist cannot cut, water that does not exist cannot moisten. Similarly, a statement that does not exist cannot deny the intrinsic nature of all things. In these circumstances, your statement that the intrinsic nature of all things has been denied is not valid. Now, so to recapitulate this argument, so what the opponent is doing here is that he's trying to impale Nagarjuna's position on his own account. So what opponent is saying is that, see, Nagarjuna refuted, any possibility of any robust theory of causation by saying that, swabhava, if it is there, if somebody argues that it's there in the object, then it has to come from somewhere, because it cannot come out of nothing, so it has to come from its cause. But where does it exist in its cause? It cannot exist in the hetu, the main cause. It cannot exist in the pratyas, the conditions. So if it exists in any one of them, then all others become redundant. So we have already looked at that argument. So now the same argument is offered against the position that Nagarjuna seems to be arguing for. So according to the opponent, he says that, see, your statement is also an entity like any other, and it also your statement also has certain hetus and pratyayas. So like mahabhutas and like no other conditions. And since its cause lies nowhere either in individually in several of these things nor collectively, therefore on the same account your statement is also void. But from here, the opponent argues that void things are sort of shouldn't be taken seriously. If your statement is void, then there is no reason for us to take it seriously, because things which are void don't function. So here we should also see that he's equating shunya with some kind of non-existence of things. So what opponent is saying is that a fire that does not exist. So this is a point about which we will talk later. So opponent equates shunyata with their non-being, and from there the opponent argues that something that does not exist is of no use. Something that's not there, to what use can you put it to? So therefore, since your statement is void on the same account which you have offered for other things, therefore your very statement is void, but void things are not to be taken seriously, and therefore we don't have any reason to take your statement seriously, and therefore your statement is non-functioning, it's of no use, it has no value, and it's as good as a non-existing fire through which we try to burn. So this is overall the argument that opponent offers against Nagarjuna's position. So understanding the opponent's argument, so what opponent seems to be saying is that your statement that all things are void could itself be considered as an entity, and since it has to have a cause like everything else in the world, and since its cause cannot be explained on your own account, therefore this statement is itself shunya. Shunya things which are shunya are incapable. This is one argument that is offered. I mean, we saw in the previous slide, fire that that is shunya doesn't burn, and shunya things are also non-existent. This is what opponent seems to be arguing. So, being shunya, your statement cannot be yielding, cannot yield anything to us. So therefore, from there, the opponent's argument could be summed up like this: that all philosophical positions are unyielding. This is on account of the Sunyavada in himself. Now this position itself, that all philosophical positions are unyielding, is a philosophical position. Therefore, the philosophical position that all philosophical positions are unyielding is itself unyielding. So this is how Nagarjuna's position is impaled on his own account. And now this argument, though this is not something that is being explicitly stated in the text, but this argument could be taken even further, and so we could even take this argument further from there to argue that therefore the opposite of it must be true, that philosophical positions are not unyielding. So therefore, drishti shunyata is not a viable position. So therefore, it sounds like a robust position against skepticism that Nagarjuna seems to have on offer. So now, now the opponent doesn't stop here. From there, the opponent in this text, Vigrahavartini, offers further arguments stating that now, if this sentence, Vakya, is endowed with an intrinsic nature, that is Swabhava, your former proposition, that is Purv Pratigya, is destroyed. There is discordance, and you should state the special reason for it. Now, you may think, in order to avoid this defect, the sentence is endowed with an intrinsic nature, and being endowed with an intrinsic nature, it is non-void, that is a shunya. Thus, the intrinsic nature of all things has been denied by it. To this we reply, if so, then your former proposition, all things are void, is destroyed. So what opponent is doing here is that opponent is posing a dilemma before Nagarjuna. dilemma is that when you state that all philosophical positions are void, then this itself being a philosophical position, either you hold that the same applies to your position and therefore your position also would be void like any other position, which as we just saw is not a viable option, because shunya things are unyielding of anything. Now, only other alternative that is still available for Nagarjuna is to say that, see, all when I state that all drishtis are shunya, or all objects are devoid of an intrinsic nature, I am not including in that scenario this position which states which makes known the shunyata or the voidness of all other things should not be taken as a part of of the set which sort of this position is referring to. So in that case he may have an escape route. Nagarjuna may have an escape route. So only other viable position that is now available to Nagarjuna is to say that even though I am stating that all philosophical positions are void, but this philosophical position is not included in those all other philosophical positions. So when I say all, I don't mean including this very position, which is stating something about all positions. So it would in that case become some kind of a meta level position, which states something about all other positions, and therefore it should not be included in the same set. But that, though apparently seems to be a viable option, is again not an option that can be philosophically sustained. And we'll see how. So to this opponent says, if so, then your former proposition all things are void is destroyed. If if Nagarjuna says that my own proposition should not be included in all things that I'm talking about, in that case also your former proposition that all things are void is destroyed. Why? Because if all things are void, then your statement is void, being included in all things, and a negation by that statement which is void is a logical impossibility in these circumstances. The negation that all things are void is not valid. This is something we have already seen. So in the other position, if on the other hand the negation that all things are void is valid, then your statement is non-void. But that negation which it establishes because it is non-void is not valid. So the other alternative is not valid, because if Nagarjuna states that his own statement is non-void but all others are, in that case his own position becomes a counter example to what he is stating. So to put it more simply, what opponent is saying is that if Nagarjuna says that my position is also void, then avoid something shouldn't be taken seriously. If he says that no, his own position is not included in all other positions, or is not included in all objects that it is a statement about, in that case this meta level statement itself becomes a counter example to the statement that all things are void. So if the statement itself, all things are not void, is itself not void, then here we have an example to prove that all things are not void, because this statement at least is not. So this way this becomes a dilemma before the skeptic, because there are only two viable options. One is when Nagarjuna is stating that all things are void, this statement is included in this in the things that the statement is about. In that case that statement itself becomes void and therefore non-functional, not to be taken seriously in that case. Only other sort of the other horn of the dilemma is that you state that this very position is not included in all things or in all objects that it is talking about. In that case this position, this statement itself becomes a counter example of what it is stating. Therefore, on both the horns of dilemma are equally unacceptable. Now, but the opponent doesn't stop here. Actually, opponent offers offers 6 different ways, 6 different options to Nagarjuna, and tries to prove that all those 6 options are equally bad. So the third statement coming from the opponent is, now if all things are void, but your statement which is affected, the negation is non-void, then your statement is not included in all things. Your proposition there is contradicted by the example. So what it means, is in a way, it's a rephrasing of the earlier argument. So what opponent is stating here is that if all things are void, but your statement is not, then your statement is not included in all things, and therefore it would work as a counter example. So we'll look at the other arguments very shortly in a few moments. Thank you. Welcome back, viewers. So we just saw, how the opponent, argues against Nagarjuna and tries to sort of pose a dilemma before him, stating that that if his very statement is included in all things, then it becomes shunya, and therefore it's an unacceptable position. And on the other hand, if it's not included in that proposition, it's not a statement which is subject to what is being stated in that position. In that case, it itself becomes a counter example of what it is stating to be the case. Now, the fourth argument is, again, a rephrasing of the earlier argument. So, in the fourth argument, the opponent states, if on the contrary, your statement is included in all things, and if all things are void, then your statement also is void. And since it is void, it cannot establish a negation. So it's just like I'm rephrasing of the same argument in different words. These are some 6 different statements that we find in Vigrahavartni against Shunyavadan position. Now, in the fifth argument, the opponent states, let us then assume that it is void and that there is the negation by it. So the only yet another alternative that seems to be available before Nagarjuna is that he could say that, well, my statement is included in all things, therefore it doesn't present a counterexample of what is being stated by it, and therefore negation by it should be accepted. So what is being stated here is that let us then assume that it is void and that there isn't yet a negation by it. All things are void, but in that case, all things, though void, would be capable of performing action, which is absurd. So, since if there is a special concession here that Nagarjuna is asking for, if he's stating that my statement is void like all other statements, but it is capable of performing action, it is yet capable of doing what it is supposed to be doing, namely negation of swabhava of all things. In that case, this special concession that Nagarjuna is asking for, then the same kind of concession should be granted to all other things. So that would be tantamount to a position where Nagarjuna could be interpreted to be saying that even though all things are void, even then they are able to perform functions which we see them doing. In that case, the person who believes in the possibility of knowledge would state that in that case, my statement, would be equally good, would be as good as yours. So, to say that things could be void and yet should be taken seriously, yet could they do what is desired out of them, they do what they are supposed to be doing, that will be a position which is absurd according to the opponent. Now the sixth statement that comes from the opponent is, let it be granted then that all things are void and that they are not capable of performing actions. Let the proposition be not contradicted by the example. In that case, however, the negation of the intrinsic nature of all things by your void statement is not valid. So, what the opponent is arguing here is that even if it is granted that all things are void, and at the same time, granting that they are capable of performing action, then this and we also at the same time allow this concession that proposition is not being contradicted by the example. In that case, negation of intrinsic nature of all things by your void statement is not valid. So therefore, all these 6 ways, all these 6 ways which are available, which seem to be available to Nagarjuna to argue sort of in favor of supposition, are found to be equally bad on opponent's account. So what is happening here is that opponent argues that your position should equally what you're stating should equally apply to your own position, in which case sort of your own position would become void, and there are only 6 possible answers to emerge out of that difficult position that you would find yourself in that case, and all those 6 escape routes are closed by the opponent. So, and furthermore, from there, the opponent argues, of Nagarjuna argues, thus, if your statement exists, there arises the following discordance. Some things are void and some other things non-void, and you should state the special reason for that discordance, explaining why some things are void while some other things are not. You have, however, not stated that reason. In these circumstances, your statement that all things are void is not valid. So therefore, if Nagarjuna states that his there should be some special status granted to his statement, that even though it is a void statement, it's yet working, though other things which are void don't function and therefore shouldn't be taken seriously, then some special case should be made for such a concession if Nagarjuna were to ask for these concessions. But however, according to the opponent, no such special reasons have been cited by Nagarjuna. Therefore, this is also not a viable option present before him. Now, on the face of it, if you look at it, it seems to be a very strong argument against, skeptic's position, against Nagarjuna's position, if, we were to believe that it's a skeptic's position. And, and it'll be interesting for us to know how Nagarjuna, could ever, have a reply to such arguments, because opponent not only presents an arguments against Nagarjuna, but also, considers, as we just saw, all the possible, different ways, 6 possible different ways, in which Nagarjuna probably could argue in favor of his position. And he already in advance, opponent forecloses all those 6 options. So it seems apparently like a dead end for Nagarjuna, for any skeptic. Now, so it'll be interesting for us to know how Nagarjuna would reply to these objections. So let's look at it. Nagarjuna's reply goes something like this. If my statement does not exist in the combination of the cause and the conditions or independently of them, then the voidness of things is established because of their being devoid of an intrinsic nature. If my statement does not exist in its cause and in its condition, it is devoid of an intrinsic nature and thus void. Now the voidness of this statement of mine is established because of its being devoid of an intrinsic nature. And just as this statement of mine is void because of its being devoid of an intrinsic nature, so also are all things void because of their being devoid of an intrinsic nature. In these circumstances, your statement, because of the voidness of your statement, is not possible to establish the voidness of things, is not valid. So now you need to look at this argument more closely. What Nagarjuna seems to be arguing, here is, so it is denying that his statement is a counterexample of what it is stating. So he says he accepts opponent's argument that, see, my statement, just like any other things in the world, my statement when I say that all things are devoid of an intrinsic nature, now my own statement, being included, being like any other object in the world, is also devoid of an intrinsic nature. And this only means, so therefore, no counter sort of example is being presented here. So my, statement that all things are devoid and the statement itself being void is, as a matter of fact, giving a further justification, is a further reinforcement, should be taken as a further reinforcement of what I am stating in my position. So what Nagarjuna is saying here is that if my statement is included in all things, then it does not harm my position. Why? Because in that case, my statement being included, if my statement is just like any other thing, then it is giving us one more example to affirm the position that I'm assuming. It's not a counterexample. So it's affirming what it's saying. So my statement, by being devoid of an intrinsic nature, is affirming what it is stating rather than contradicting what it is stating. So if my position is included, if my statement is included in all things, then my position is strengthened further rather than being weakened by it. Furthermore, Nagarjuna states that nature of the things which is dependent is called voidness. For that nature which is dependent is devoid of an intrinsic nature. You have not understood the meaning of the voidness of the things. So you have set out to criticize me, saying, since your statement is devoid of an intrinsic nature, the negation of the intrinsic nature of the things is not void. That nature of the things which is dependent is voidness. Why? Because it is devoid of an intrinsic nature. Those things which are dependently originated are not indeed endowed with an intrinsic nature, for they have no intrinsic nature. Why? Because they are dependent on causes and conditions. If the things were by their own nature, they would be so even without the aggregate of causes and conditions. But they are not so. Therefore, they are said to be devoid of an intrinsic nature and hence void. So, the point that we need to understand here is Nagarjuna in return tells the opponent that, see, this you are sort of misinterpreting my position because you haven't understood what I mean by dependent origination of things. Namely, the notion of pratit samutpad. The notion of pratit samutpad is that if nature, if things had anything of their own or any swabhava of their own, that would mean that they are not dependent on anything else. If we are stating some kind of independent status to anything, then what we mean by it is, and this is what we mean by the term swabhava. Swa meaning own, of one's own, bhava mean existence. So, Pratita Samutpad as a position, argues that there is nothing in the object that is its own, because any object is sustained by other conditions. So, and an example, like that I've offered in some of my earlier lectures is, we ourselves. So, every moment we depend, for our existence on a number of, other things, basically, the elements. So, we require air for our sustenance, without which, in a few moments, in a few minutes, we wouldn't be sort of able to sustain our life. So, that being so, there is no swabhava that we, that is nothing in our existence that we could claim as not borrowed from the other. So, it is in that sense things are void. So, according to Nagarjuna, since his position hasn't been understood properly by the opponent, this is why this, he's misunderstanding Nagarjuna's position, and therefore, all these arguments are coming from him. So further, Nagarjuna says, likewise it follows that my statement also, being dependently originated, is devoid of an intrinsic nature and hence void. But things like a cart, a pot, a cloth, etc., though devoid of an intrinsic nature, because of being dependently originated, are occupied with their respective functions. For example, carrying wood, grass, and earth, containing honey, water, and milk, and protecting from cold, wind, and heat. Similarly, this statement of mine, though devoid of an intrinsic nature because of being dependently originated, is engaged in the task of establishing the being devoid of an intrinsic nature of the things. In these circumstances, your statement being devoid of an intrinsic nature is void, and being devoid, it cannot negate the intrinsic nature of all things, is not valid. So, to understand what Nagarjuna is saying here in a simpler way, what he's saying here is that, see, first of all, he accepts opponent's argument that since, things are void, as Nagarjuna is stating. Why? Because they are dependently originated. Is his statement also dependently originated? Nagarjuna says yes, his statement is also dependently originated, and therefore is a part of, all things, that are the subject of the statement, all things are void. He accepts opponent's argument that his statement, is included, in this universal proposition, stating the voidness of all things. But what he doesn't accept in the opponent's argument is that void things don't function, because as we saw earlier, opponent is arguing that things which are void should not be taken seriously because void things don't work. So the argument, as we would remember, is that fire that does not exist. Therefore, the meaning that opponent derives is, if somebody says, if somebody talks about shunyata of fire, that would mean non-existence of fire. That would mean fire that doesn't exist. So, the way the opponent is interpreting Nagarjuna's position is that shunyata means non-being of something, and therefore those things which do not have a being cannot function. So he says, therefore, if fire is void, then it cannot burn. If water is void, then it cannot moisten. And if your statement is void, then it cannot state anything. And therefore, your statement is non-functional. So, whereas Nagarjuna accepts, opponent's argument that his statement is included in all things and therefore void, but he does not accept the conclusion that opponent derives from there, that void things don't work. He says, even though things are void, they are engaged in their respective functions. So functionality of thing is a separate question, is a different question, and voidness of things is a different question, and both should not be conflated the way opponent seems to be doing here. So Nagarjuna seems to find an escape route by stating that things could be void and at the same time they could be engaged in performing their function, like a pot which provides an empty space inside itself for other things to be contained in it, like a cart which absolutely performs its function well by carrying things and so on and so forth, despite there being the fact about them that at the ultimate level, at the paramathic level, all these things have a borrowed existence since they are dependently originated. So even if a thing is dependently originated, it could perform functions, like for example, any human being. So right now, I'm, my existence is dependent upon, if I'm, I'm having air constantly, I'm sort of inhaling and exhaling, and my existence depends on this, and therefore, my existence in that sense is a borrowed existence. I'm dependently originated in that sense, but yet I'm delivering a lecture right now, and that way I'm sort of doing that a particular function that I'm expecting myself to perform right now. So that means even if things are dependently originated and therefore don't have a swabhava, yet they do function, they are seen to function, and therefore functionality is a separate question. Furthermore, Nagarjuna argues, suppose that a person artificially created should prevent another artificial person, or that a magic man should prevent another man created by his own magic from doing something of the same nature, would be this negation. Suppose that an artificial man should prevent another artificial man occupied with something, or that a magic man created by a magician should prevent another magic man created by his own magic and occupied with something. There the artificial man who is prevented is void, and he, the artificial man who prevents, is also void. The magic man who is prevented is void, and he, the magic man who prevents it, is also void. So, as a counterexample, Nagarjuna says, we can imagine a person who's been created out of magic, and preventing another person which is equally magically created. So he says, all philosophical positions are fiction, all right, and my philosophical my position stating the fictionality of all the other positions itself being a fiction, but it could be yet be engaged in performing its function, because functionality is something different. So it's like one magic man sort of fighting with another magic man. But I think we can better understand this argument maybe through some other closer at hand example. So say for example, if we talk about dream. Now, dream, of course, nobody can argue against, the fictional nature of dreams, the non-real nature of dreams. But at the same time, we cannot deny that, in case of nightmares, we do get frightened. So, in a certain sense, even though being fictional, even though being non-real, dream does something real to us, namely that it frightens, a person. Or, if it's a pleasant dream, it does something desirable to the person concerned. So, and similarly, in other situations of error, like if somebody sees rope in a snake, it could result in something real. So even though the rope that we are seeing there is fictional, but sort of like, I mean, let's take the other way around. I mean, a snake, seen in a rope, so it would like, I mean, frighten us. So that frightening of it would be a real frightening happening to a real person. So therefore, what Nagarjuna wants, to sort of, wants to put forward here is that functionality of things and fictionality of things, we could put it this way. So functionality of things and functionality of things are two different issues, and one does not actually affect the other. So even if things are fictional, they could perform their function well. So yet another example could be cinema. So in cinema, what what we see on the screen is unreal. We know the story to be fictional, or at least sort of not real in the robust sense of the term. But what it does to us is something real. What we watch cinema for, like, I mean, we sort of pay for the ticket for something real to happen to us, and something real does seem to happen to us when we watch the cinema, which is actually non-real. So therefore, Nagarjuna is able to rescue his position by stating that even though Nagarjuna accepts that his position, is shunya, I mean, his statement is shunya, but it does not, mean that it's not meaningful. It does not mean that it should be held to be useless, meaningless. It could have meaning, it could be meaningful, it could be stating something real, though itself being, void. So, Nagarjuna, in the text Vigrahavartini, finally states that, in like manner, a negation of the intrinsic nature of all things by my statement is possible. Even though the statement is void, in these circumstances, your statement, because of the voidness of your statement, a negation of the intrinsic nature of all things is not possible, is not valid. In this way is also prevented the controversial discussion in 6 points that you spoke of. For this being so, it is not true that my statement is not included in all things. There is nothing that is non-void, nor are all things non-void. So, those 6 different possibilities that were suggested by the opponent, Nagarjuna finds an escape route through all of them, and he states that my statement declaring shunyata of all things itself being shunya, all right, but it can make a real declaration about the things, which it does. So finally, what Nagarjuna says about his position is that this statement of mine, being dependently originated, is not endowed with an intrinsic nature, as previously stated. Since it is not endowed with an intrinsic nature, it is void. And since this statement of mine is void, just as all other things are void, there is no discordance. For there would be a discordance only if we said, this statement is non-void while all other things are void. We, however, do not say that. There is therefore no discordance, and since the following discordance, the statement is non-void while all other things are void, does not exist, we do not have to state the special reason. For this reason, the statement is non-void while all other things are void. In these circumstances, your statement, that is opponent statement, there is on your part an abandonment of position, there is a discordance, and you should state the special reason is not valid. So the point here, that Nagarjuna is making here is that Nagarjuna is not asking for any special concession for his own statement. So he's not saying that while all other things are void, as stated by the statement that Nagarjuna offers. So while all of the things are Shunya, but his own statement is not, that kind of concession should be granted. But in that case, if he says that this special concession should be granted here, then he would be asking, he will have to state reasons why this special concession should be granted to his position and not others, and therefore the onus would be upon Nagarjuna to state those special reasons. So Nagarjuna in this statement here states that there is no onus upon me to state special reasons, because I am not asking for any special concessions to take my statement out of the things that this statement is about. So therefore, here we see how Sunyavadan position, as stated as stated by Nagarjuna, how that could be viewed as a skeptic's position, stating that no knowledge is possible. If he says, if we interpret his position that of drishti shunyata, coming from swabhav shunyata, if we take the position of drishti shunyata as a skeptic's position, then Nagarjuna has to face those classical objections that have always been posed against skeptic's position. And here we saw how very cleverly Nagarjuna tries to give an answer in his very own way, in his very unique, in his very different way, against the objections that he faces from the opponent. So in our next lecture, we'll sort of we'll take more arguments that are offered against Nagarjuna's position, and we'll see how Sunyavadan argues replies to those arguments. Thank you.
On that note, I would like to thank sir for this very enriching discussion, and thank you, dear friends, for watching our show. Stay tuned and keep watching. Thank you.